something which we at Deloitte hold dear, and I'm not going to steal any of Joe's thunder because Joe's going to tell you a bit about what we're doing at Deloitte and within the planning team at Deloitte around the issue of diversity. So I just wanted to welcome you. I'll be back at the end to sort of direct on where we're going next. But I'll hand over to Victoria in a second. Just one piece of housekeeping. There is no fire alarm tonight, fire test. So if there is an alarm, please do exit via the fire escape and you'll be directed externally. But welcome once again, and I hope it's a very interesting evening. Victoria.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to Deloitte Real Estate for hosting this evening. I won't take up too much time, but I did want to take the opportunity to say a few opening remarks about tonight's event on behalf of the Royal Town Planning Institute. Those of you who know me will know I joined the Institute relatively recently, and indeed I'm still on probation. In fact, my boss is sat in the audience. I won't embarrass him, but hopefully I do okay tonight and we make it through to the end. In thinking about important things for planning, the profession, the built environment, and trying to encapsulate those, I came up with 4 Ds, and they were delivery, decisions, disruption and diversity. And I really wanted to move forward the conversation on diversity in planning and the built environment more broadly. And a lot of people are talking about diversity for very positive reasons. Sometimes we see some negative reasons in the press on diversity. But I feel, and I'm sure many of you do, that planning and those of us who play a role in the built environment have a really important opportunity to take forward the debate on diversity. And from a planning perspective, it's really rather simple. It's about being as representative as the communities we represent. Planners in particular are very much find themselves at the coalface, out speaking with communities, talking about quite tricky topics and subjects like new homes, new development, but sometimes it can be topics to do with agriculture or aquaculture or all manner of environmental issues, many of which get local people quite interested, sometimes vexed and upset, and interested and at best we hope enthused. And having a professional body that is professional, and I'm very sure that our planners are very professional, but really represents that community, I think is really quite important. In a past job in transport planning, when I was head of transport for the mayor, and then in my most latter job at Old Oak and Park Royal, it was really important that we got as many people who were involved in living in communities, actually involved in helping to shape the future community. And so for me, that's really what this event is about, is how can we make the built environment and planning in particular more representative of communities, so that we can have very open and honest conversations, but also have communities feeling engaged and they're part of that conversation. So I'm delighted to have brought together what I think is a really stellar panel here, and I can't take all of this credit, by the way. Although I had in my mind I would like to do an event, it was very proactively. Why Deloitte? Well, Deloitte won the RTPI Planning Consultancy of the Year, and it was Joe here who got in touch and said, I've got all these ideas, what can we do? And we had a chat and we came up with this tonight. So delighted that we've been able to put this together. And it's not just about me speaking, indeed I'll shut up in a moment, because we've got a phenomenal breadth of knowledge, interest and passion here. I will do my best to chair it tonight. I am going to be strict and give each of them 5 minutes. I've got my stop clock there, because the really important part is the debate, but also for these sorts of things, it's the networking and it's those connections that you'll make that will help you in your day-to-day careers and beyond. So that's all I'm going to say for now. Really delighted to see you all here. Thank you very much. I'm going to take my seat now. I can clap if you want.
Can you introduce me or do you want me to stand up?
Sorry?
Do you want me to just stand up?
It's up to you. I think, I think my mic is turned on here. If you're happy to stand up.
Yeah. Can you hear? Is my mic on? Yeah. I'm not going to stand there. I don't like lecterns at the best of time. Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for the invite. And I'm delighted to be here to support this launch today. And I'm going to start by going a bit off piste, really, and then come back to the agenda. I'm going to try and remind you what planning is all about to start off with. And I'm going to give you a bit about, if you remember, the very first bit of legislation that was about planning was 1908. And when John Burns introduced that Act into Parliament, he said the following: the object of the bill is to provide domestic condition for the people in which their physical health, their morals, their character, their whole social condition can be improved by what we hope to secure in this bill. The bill aims to secure the home healthy, the house beautiful, the town pleasant, the city dignified, and the suburb salubrious. And many of you would have heard that quote before, because it's quite a good one to try and promote planning. What's less reported is what he then went on to say as well, which he talked about the importance of the bill going through Commons, saying that it gave the opportunity to communities, especially growing and industrial communities, the opportunity to consciously shape their own environment to the better way than it's occurred in the past. That was in 1909. Now, since then, of course, you will all be familiar with all the legislation that's gone on, and I suppose the last time someone spoke to me, they said there's like 55 different planning acts, isn't it time to consolidate them all, Steve? I said, yeah, I'm sure it is. What Victoria said in her opening remarks is true, which is a profession should represent the community that it's planning for. And I think that's really important. And one of the things that we've been trying to do, and the government's been supporting this, is trying to promote the diversity inclusivity. We have a team within MHCLG which is specifically dealing with faith and inclusion, and they're working across the government's agenda. So earlier tonight I was talking about trying to set up some more workshops, to do some more work on this, and I was saying don't forget this is not just through the lens of planning. The Secretary of State believes this is important across all the areas that he's responsible for, and he's absolutely committed to try and promote this as a government agenda. From my point of view, I have committed, we've all the SCS in the department have had to commit to a diversity and inclusivity objective in their objectives this year, and I was very keen to say, yeah, I can do that. And I specifically made a commitment this year to increase the number of planners that are working in the civil service from a BAME background. And that was triggered by the fact that I get the planners in the civil service together about once every 6 months, and we talk about planning in the government's agenda and things, and there's a career in the civil service for planners. And I'm afraid I found myself looking out on a sort of sea of white faces, if I'm honest. And I looked around and said, well, in that audience there was only 3 people from a BAME background. And so it was quite an easy objective for me to commit to and say, I'm going to change this. There needs to be more diversity in the planning cadre who are dealing with government policy, because the community that the government works through is a much more mixed community than the one I'm looking out at and seeing here. So we have that commitment, and of course I was reminded in taking that commitment that when I first got involved with this sort of agenda, it was when I first became chief planner. Sort of now I have to confess to you, over 10 years ago. And I was working with the RTPI. And the RTPI had a programme to try and place people from a BAME background into local government. And I worked with Chris Shepley, there's a name you may be familiar with, he writes in the magazine. And Chris and I were trying to sort of increase the proportion of planners from a BAME background. And at the time, a success measure was, I think it went up from 6% to 7%. I think that 10 years on, I think we can do better than that, and we ought to set a higher ambition than that. And I'm very pleased to be part of this debate to try and be part of a programme of events which we want to try and take forward to promote a different approach. And of course, it's not just about BAME. It's a much broader agenda than that. It's about a diversity which you'll hear from some of the other panel members. And I'm particularly keen to promote the breadth of this agenda, and it's one of the reasons why I'm here tonight. And my final point before I sit down, my 5 minutes is pretty much over, is to say that we don't have the monopoly of knowledge. We don't have the wisdom to say we've got all the solutions. So you and the people that you know have a role to play in helping people like me deliver a different agenda.
very much, Stephen, and you were so eager to start. I didn't get the opportunity to introduce you.
Oh, no, maybe I did get the opportunity. I said, do you want to introduce me? I said.
But we're very honoured to have the Chief Planner here today, and to hear that the voice from government and that commitment to change, which is really important. So we're now going to move on to Priya Shah. Now, you founded Bain in Property back in, well, it was really launched this year, actually. So we're really interested to hear a little bit more about how that came about and why it's important.
I think I might just stay here. Sorry, I lost my voice last week, so it's slightly husky, but hopefully it will last my 5 minutes. As Victoria just said, we launched this year. Really proud to have held 3 events. Only last month we held our Black History Month event, which was really interesting. It was looking at the housing issues faced by the Windrush generation and beyond, and just really looking at how we can engage better with diverse communities. But for the purpose of this panel, and just for everyone in the audience, I really wanted to talk about really what spurred me to set up Bain Property. I've worked in the property and planning industry as a comms consultant for almost 4 years now. And what I noticed was that all the people that I was working with in my company, that I was interacting with, everyone that I was seeing on networking panels, were largely of one kind, dare I say it, white, middle class and male. And although there were women, still not 50%, but we are doing really well on the women front, there's very little ethnic diversity in the workplace and when I was seeing my clients. And this is something which is really important to me. So I've grown up in Harrow, and population is almost 64% from an ethnic minority background. And naturally, my upbringing has formed who I am today, and it obviously goes without saying I'm openly cultural and very Indian when I'm with my friends and my family back home, but I haven't always felt comfortable being that way in the workplace. With 14% of the UK identifying as BAME or part BAME, it's really disappointing that the built environment sector only has 1.2% of people from an ethnic minority background. So based on the above reason, it dawned upon me that lots of young people from BAME backgrounds were looking at an industry which was completely unrepresentative of themselves. And this can really be the push and pull factor on whether they enter, remain, and actually continue in their careers. Even I was asking myself that question, why do BAME people enter the industry but rarely make it beyond middle management? And this was especially because BAME people are ambitious. We do want to do well, but clearly something was going wrong here. And I was really keen to find out these reasons. And when I held my second event in June, we actually explored some of the hurdles that BAME people are facing in the industry with regards to, total lack of mentorship. They don't really know who to go to. It can be quite uncomfortable. How do they ask for time off for, festivals, other cultural events? It can often be difficult when there's that complete lack of representation already in your company. And I do intend to hold more sessions like this, as it's really important to understand the issue before trying to resolve it. So that was why it was important from an internal perspective. But diversity is also important when it comes to responding to housing and planning issues. After watching the events unfold after the Grenfell fire last year, I noticed a few things. So the majority of people living in Grenfell Tower were of an ethnic minority background. And aside from their grievances, arguably being ignored before the fire itself, the response after the fire was also not ethnically mindful. So during this period, it was Ramadan, and many tenants who were living in Grenfell were also observing Ramadan, and being able to continue this would have and should have actually been a priority during such a difficult time. They should have been able to go and actually fast and just try and act as normal during such a hard time. However, it felt like the short-term response largely focused on the blame game, trying to attribute responsibility, when realistically this was never going to be achieved in the week after the actual fire. So even now, throughout the inquiry, the issue of ethnic diversity, or lack of, has been raised several times, and it's shocking that an entire block, which had largely ethnic minorities, lacks that diverse representation at the top for the inquiry. It's so important that they are represented in a completely ethically mindful way. So, in short, BAME and property is important to me and important for the industry because it's got to be working for the people we're trying to serve. You need the best inputs to achieve the best outputs. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya. There's a lot of food for thought there, and I'm sure that will prompt some questions. But before we move on to questions, we must move on to our next panellist, Simon Brooksbank. I wouldn't say founder or co-founder of Planning Out in July 16.
Yes.
And really looking forward to hearing more about that organisation and why that's important for planning in the built environment.
Thank you. So yes, I'm Simon Brooksbank, co-chair of Planning Out, and it's delighted to be here this evening. Since I co-founded Planning Out with Rob, delighted he's here this evening, we've done a series of events. We did an event last year with Amy LeMay, who's the Night Czar, who spoke at City Hall about protecting LGBT venues. We did a site visit at Battersea Power Station just about a month ago, which was a lot of fun. We're all there on our PPE. And just 2 weeks ago, we had a parliamentary reception, which Helen Hayes, MP, hosted, who's an ex-planner. So it's great that she's stayed true to her roots and still involved in the planning sector and helping us. So in terms of LGBT issues, and in some ways it's different from perhaps other diversity issues, because while with gender and ethnicity it's quite visible, for sexuality it can be invisible. It's quite easy to hide being gay. And one of the issues that historically has been faced is about hiding who you are. It's about not being true to yourself. And one of the reasons why I co-founded Planning Out was to try and address that and to try and sort of follow on some of the work that's been done previously. So, first of all, I want to talk about the moral case for diversity and particularly for LGBT issues. So I'm going to talk from a personal perspective that when I was growing up, particularly in my teens and even in my 20s, I felt very uncomfortable with my sexuality. Fear of people what would think, fear of isolation, fear of rejection, or fear of embarrassment. And that, when I speak for myself, I also speak for other people as well, because if I was feeling it myself, there would be others who are feeling exactly the same. And you might say, well, that's all very well and good, but what impact does that actually have on society? What impact does that have on people, say LGBT people who are going to the planning sector? Well, what it does is it means that it affects your self-confidence, it affects your creativity, it affects your self-worth, and affects relationships at work. If you're having to hide who you are, if you can't sort of be open about who you are in the way that if you're straight, you say, oh, what are you up to this weekend? I'm going with my wife, or catching up with my kids. Whereas if you feel you can't do that at work, that really has a real impact on your work relationships and your ability to collaborate on a more professional level. And it also affects mental health as well. If you're having to hide who you are, if you can't be true to yourself, that also has a profound effect. So kind of what is really great to see, and it is amazing to see the changes that have been happening over these past few decades, to see how people can really put that aside and they can really fulfill their true potential. They're not bound, they're not held back by having to hide who they are, and they can reach their full potential and reach their full talents. So let's talk about from the business case for diversity. So if you can be yourself, and if you can be comfortable who you are, and you can and you feel you're happy in yourself, happy in the work environment, that in itself means you perform better in your everyday life, in your profession. And that's a really important aspect in terms of companies having that kind of collaborative approach. Another point I should also make is that now that we're in an environment where diversity and LGBT issues is dealt with a lot more proactively, is actually if you don't do more than that, if you're not actually trying to unpick some of the damage and you're celebrating things like Pride, just saying it's great, you can be yourself, we really support you in being yourself. If you're not doing that, then actually you might, first of all, you lose out on perhaps LGBT people who might not want to work for you because they think, well, I want to work for a company that represents who I am. But also, for a lot of people I've heard saying it is a litmus test for diversity as well. So if a company perhaps doesn't address that, perhaps doesn't take it as seriously as they might, it might put off other talent. So it is really an issue about attracting the best and the brightest in the industry, which obviously all companies and organisations want to do. So in terms of what the end goal is, we've achieved a lot, and I think it's really something we can be really proud of. Just as a nation, but particularly, I think property has lagged behind other industries, but it is definitely making progress. But doing things like planning out, having that visibility where you can just go along and you can be comfortable being yourself is important. But we're still not there. We've still got a lot more we could do. There are a lot of people still in the property sector who are LGBT, who perhaps aren't out. That's something that needs to change and should change. But as I said, through doing things like planning out, through having the visibility, through having events like this, where we're talking about this issue, it does make change. And sometimes public opinion and changing, it's like moving a tanker sometimes. It's sort of through small incremental changes over time, it does make an impact. So I look forward to questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. And I should just have said at the start, actually, in terms of that wider impact, it's not just the people in the room. This is being recorded, so this will be available on various YouTube channels afterwards. So this debate tonight is really quite important because it's not just a closed room debate. This will go around the world and have some influence, I hope, in a positive way. Now, we're moving on to women in planning, and we're moving on to Rachel Herbert, who is the incoming chair of Women in Planning London. I think that's correct. But Women in Planning have been around a little bit longer, since 2012. So with the benefit of this experience and the growth that you've seen nationally, we're really looking forward to hearing about the impact and influence that you're having. Thank you, Rachel.
Okay, so as the name suggests, I'm here to talk about gender equality. Since 2012, there's now 10 branches across the UK, which is pretty phenomenal. London was the original branch in effect, but there's another 4 opening, I think, by the end of the year. So it is just quite monumental. And our 2 founders, Charlotte Morford and Alison Mackay, they originally sort of started the network based on just feeling that perhaps when you go to events, it was fairly male-heavy, and also being at perhaps a more junior stage in their career, they felt it was quite difficult and potentially cliquey to sort of try and get to know the people in the room. So it started off being perhaps one of the networks which has probably been pitched to more junior levels of the planning and built environment industry. But as we've sort of progressed over the years, it is becoming much more diverse in terms of our experience and the members we're attracting. So it's not just a moral issue, it also makes good business sense. There's been plenty of studies on it. I won't dwell on it too much because we all know that women are underrepresented still. There's obviously been lots of new initiatives that have been making real inroads. The gender pay gap, reporting, flexible working, shared paternity leave, targets, they're all making good strides. That said, there's still a long way to go. Some of the stats are still quite astronomical to think it could be 170 years until we have gender equality in the workplace. I don't quite follow how that's right. I don't think my grandchildren will ever see it, but it's good to know about these things to actually think about it. But when you look at 7 CEOs in the FTSE 100, in 20 years the gender pay gap has only improved by 0.5%. That's pretty phenomenal. Another report talking about what some of the key findings and issues are there. Again, unconscious bias, pretty startling that was the headline. So with that context in mind, who are we and what are we doing? We're women-led, but we're not exclusively for women. We believe in, obviously, diversity in all forms. So we're very much inviting men to join our events and help champion the promotion of women within the built environment. one thing that we're quite proud of is that we're independent now, events are free, so there's no barrier to coming along. Also, it's all ages, all experience. There's really no hurdle. So what are we doing? What's our vision? Basically trying to increase the visibility of women in the workplace, particularly in obviously the built environment planning. A big part of what we're trying to do is obviously show that you can actually get to the higher levels within our professions. It's not just about being seen perhaps in more junior levels. We really are trying to make people aware of the fact that actually we have some amazing women who are actually head of various departments. The GLA is very female heavy, which is fantastic. So it's about sort of promoting that and just showing that it is actually happening. Another thing is obviously we do a lot of networking events, and the intent with those is obviously to create a place where people feel comfortable to network, and they can talk openly about perhaps the challenges they're facing or any of the apprehensions they have about the workplace. And one thing we're doing recently is we're launching a member survey to understand what the issues are for our members and how we can better combat those moving forward. Another thing we're trying to do is show there's various different paths in the profession. So we show both public, private and third sector. We also offer our members opportunities to put themselves forward. We have various blogs, 46 in the last 6 years. It's a few, but we could do a lot better, obviously. But the idea is to give people an opportunity to put themselves forward. A lot of these blogs are about promoting diversity, not just in terms of women in the workplace, but in wider issues, inclusiveness generally. And in terms of our progression over time, we started off with what was known as the Proud of Women series, which is very much focused on having some very senior women come in and talk to us about their career progression, the challenges they face, top tips to success, the importance of perhaps aligning yourself with a mentor. That series went for about 2.5 years, and I went to many of them. They were fantastic. But something we've been trying to do the last 18 months is focusing more on just showing women actually leading and making the hard calls, just talking about the issues as opposed to talking about their struggles or how it's harder for them to actually be at the top being female, because it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And so the more you see that, I think the more seeing is believing is basically what we're trying to achieve with the latest event series. And so what are we doing going forward? Basically continuing as we are, again trying to diversify our membership base, not just with more branches but also with the depth of experience. Another thing we're doing is a Day in the Life of series, which is similar to the Stylist magazine. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's again trying to show the different, basically the different roles people have within planning, and also to perhaps break down the barriers of what some of the more senior women are doing, so you get more of a feel for the different job opportunities. And then the other thing, we're just going to perhaps monitor events a bit more closely. We don't think there's a need for any more male-only panels, and we also just generally going to try and influence some positive change in the workplace, mostly through our membership surveys. We're going to try and really gauge as to what the real issues are for our female members. That's just obviously how you can follow us, getting quite active in that space. And yeah, I quite like this quote. The glass ceiling will only go away when women help other break... Sorry, I ruined it. The glass ceiling only work when women help other women break through that ceiling. So, thank you.
Great. Very much, Rachel, and again, lots of thought-provoking items there, particularly given the longevity now of the organisation and what you've been able to do nationwide. I think that's a really interesting model that will be up for discussion. So before we open up to questions, I'm going to move us on to our last panellist, Jo Dennis-Jones. And really, Jo, as I alluded to earlier, was the architect behind tonight's event. Said there must be an event in this. What can we do? So I'm really delighted, A, that we've made it happen, and B, that you are here tonight and going to tell us about what I think Deloitte are doing.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Victoria. Welcome, everybody. So, I read a lot of books to my children, and they like to play a little game, which is trying to match the characters to different family members. Now, what I find really fascinating about that is that they don't look to mirror looks. What they look for is the characteristics, something that's a bit more emotive that links those different characters. And I find that really compelling. And I think there's something in that real insight about the emotiveness and how characteristics and personalities really make ourselves feel. And I think that's a real insight in terms of how we can drive change today. But let's get a bit more practical. How do we attract, retain and engage a diverse workforce? Well, at Deloitte, that conversation started in 2012 and we had 12% female partners. So some targets were set, everyone sat back, fast forward 2 years, and our female representation was 12%. So what was discovered there was really that we needed to make some fundamental changes. It's not a nice to have, it's absolutely business critical. And that responsibility to drive the change was very much led by our CEO, David Sproul, and our managing partner of talent, Emma Codd. And the first action was to look at the data. There were clear patterns at student entry point all the way up to sort of senior manager when the women sort of fell off the cliff in terms of barriers that were holding them back. And let me give you one example. The graduate recruitment programme was on a first come, first served basis. So the men generally got involved, submitted their application, done. The women generally thought about it, did some more research, spoke to family members, then decided to submit their application form. So we're losing those women at the absolute entry point, and that had to change. Now, it's important to say at this point that we're seeking to get more women into leadership positions was how it started, but we're very much moved very quickly into looking at a programme about diversity across all areas, and through, in particular, the Respect and Inclusion programme. Now, part of that was the Ask Yourself video, which I hope most of you saw in the foyer today, which we had rolling on a loop. That was from 2015, but I found that so powerful and so compelling, and I really hope you've seen that. And if not, please, it's on YouTube, so watch it afterwards. But I only have a few minutes today, so let's get to some key messages. So one of them, in terms of the data and what we looked at, was bants. Those little comments that are made in the office that are a joke, but have the power collectively to really undermine, to disengage, and to lose faith in your company. Oh, you're leaving early again, are you, tonight? Oh, well, you're only part of the team if you come out drinking with us. Those kind of things, and really to look at that kind of change. But I also, and a part of that was having a firm-wide cultural shift in terms of looking at that, and that's a really, really important point I'll come back to. The Respect and Inclusion programme was launched, and that started off with looking at the sort of top senior leadership of 6,000 colleagues, and then that's been an ongoing rolling programme that we're still very much active in today. But let's come back to culture for a minute, because it's really important. Genuine, visible leadership. It's about changing mindsets. It's about changing behaviours. And it also, when we looked at it at the time, wasn't about fixing women. It was about fixing the workplace. And that's very much across the diversity piece we talk about today. It's about looking at the need of the individual, and it's about looking at the need of the business. And that's really important. So part of that, in terms of the strategy, is having a very clear action plan. And an action plan that's with the data, and it's got structured programmes. Now, this needs to be an absolutely top-table conversation. This needs to be CEO-led, and it needs to be the executive board, and then to be time at meetings every time to make that happen. To recognise it's not going to be a quick fix. You're in for the long haul. But to keep promoting the key principles so they absolutely embed in the culture. I just want to touch on as well 2 key areas. Agile working and removing unconscious bias. The agile working, there's a very key terminology here. It's not part-time, it's not flexible, it's agile and it's open for all, and we've taken great strides there here at Deloitte. And I was really lucky this year to experience the removal of unconscious bias in our recruitment programme, where we've had blind interviews. And I must say I found that really compelling, really, really powerful. So where are we today? Well, the good news is we're now 19% female partners on the board, so we have gone up. The programmes have been working. And last year we launched our BAME action plan as well, so we'll be really keen to see how that's going to start progressing and taking more time. We're proud of what we've done, but we recognise that it's still so much to do. So what can you take away? What have we learned? We've learned you've got to interrogate the data. We've learned you've got to set targets and be accountable and have a programme. But what we fundamentally learned is that you've got to focus on that top-down programme of culture. And our message is very clear. Diversity is not possible without inclusion, and inclusion is not possible without respect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo, and thank you to all our speakers. It's really punchy, which gives us time for some questions. And just while you're reflecting on those, I think your point there on an action plan really resonated with me, because something we've been able to do with the RTPI very recently, we haven't launched it yet, but the board have very recently signed off an equalities and inclusivity vision statement. We never had one before, and that's an overarching mission, if you like. And underneath that, we're going to have an action plan. And that action plan will report directly into me in the way you've said, driving it forward with a very clear list of programmes, because there's no problem with buying into it. The Board of Trustees, the General Assembly, the staff, the planning profession, everyone buys into the concept of inclusivity and equalities, but still nothing happens. And without that very concerted, what is it you're actually going to do and what are you going to change about some of these issues, that I think the change can really be achieved. And that's why tonight is really quite a treat for me, because I'm using you all as a bit of a focus group to help inform that early stage of what we might put in our action plan. But joking apart, this isn't just about planning, it's a much, much broader issue, which is why I'm pleased to see so many people from across the built environment industry and beyond, and students here tonight. Yes, we can talk about planning, but we also need to talk about construction, engineering, transport, rail, surveying, architecture. All of these things are interlinked. I'm delighted to have Katie Mulholland here, who's President of Women in Transport. We've been talking, hedging a sort of a master plan to do a much broader symposium across the built environment, because it's not just planning. But tonight it is just planning. So let's just open up the floor now. We've got a little bit of time for some questions and observations, and we do have some microphones. We've got some hands going up already, but if I can ask if you can wait for the microphone before it comes. We've got past President Steve Wilkinson from the RTPI, who's had the first hand up. So I'd like a lady with the next hand up.
Sorry, I should have kept my hand down. Okay, I mean, thank you for your series of very interesting presentations, and so in particular those which were very personal as well, because this is sort of an agenda which is fought at a very personal level. I suppose for me, why this is so critical to the planning profession is because planning is about resource distribution. It's about making those political decisions, and it's important that planners are seen to have that empathy. And the best way that professionals can have empathy is by reflecting the community they serve, the point that Victoria made. Now, 30 years ago, I worked for what the Daily Mail, also mentioned tonight, I think, identified as loony left councils. Because I regard them as progressive councils, because they supported women in planning, and there was a big agenda around women in planning 30 years ago in Haringey, Islington, all the inner London councils and the GLC. And there also was a drive for more people from BAME communities as well. But progress has been glacial, really, and I really want to find out really what now in terms of what you think. What's the critical difference now between where we were like 30 years ago and where we are now, and how this sort of how learning can be taken from this to events like this to inform improvement across the whole of the construction sector.
Okay, would anyone like to take that? So really, why is it going to be different now? Because you're right, people have said to me, we talked about this 30 years ago and nothing's happened. So why is it going to be different this time?
Shall I start on some of that? I think I touched upon it, but I think business critical. Now, I can't tell you what happened 30 years ago, but I think certainly where we are now is that we're recognising that the fundamental progress of business is about looking at our talent pool. And if we're limiting ourselves on a talent pool, the word go, then we're not going to be progressing in business. So I think that's a really key part of it. I think also we're much more of a global communities. And I think to learn from those communities is really, really important. And it's nice to see Gerald here in the audience today. He's one of our summer vacation students, and he's originally from Singapore. And we had a great chat about social housing in Singapore over the summer. And I could have read about that, but he told me about it, and he told me about it from his heart. And I think you talked about being emotive, and I think it's so important to get that emotion and that understanding coming forward.
Any other thoughts as to why?
Yeah, I mean, I think that although at times it may not feel like it, I think that the debate is more mainstream now. I think that 30 years ago it may have been, as you say, seen as a I think you say loony left or extremist type of view. I think that it's much more mainstream now. It's part of a central agenda, and it isn't just big businesses, but it's seen by government to be important and by other institutions. So it's mainstream.
I would say that my fear is that it will keep taking forever, if I'm honest. Yes, it's chipping away, but it really is chipping away. So obviously we need to do as much as we can, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're still talking about 40% on boards instead of 30% in 20, 30 years' time.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move to the next question. If you don't mind saying who you are or where you're from, thank you.
Not sure if it's a question or it's just a comment, because I'm so old that I was around 30 years ago. I'm a barrister by training, and when I started, women were very unusual, and I was the first lady in my chambers, and I had to put up with quite a lot of shit, to be perfectly frank. The reason I think it's changing is because today's youngsters, who are the future for all of our companies, will not put up with it. And I also think that there is a recognition that training, today's pale, male and stale guys need training. And I think that for those reasons, I agree that the future is a little bleak because of the progress that has been so slow. But I salute all of you youngsters, because it's the youngsters that will drive, I think, things forward far more quickly than the oldies.
So that excludes me then, does it?
Yeah, I'm afraid it does, Steve. I'm afraid it does.
Bit of ageism there.
If I could just come in, before Priya does, I think actually, yes, the youngsters will drive it, but we actually need those people who are in positions of power now to drive it as well, which is why I'm pleased that the demographics that we have here today on the panel and in the audience is broader than just what I would call the usual suspects.
Just to add to that, I think it's really important to remember that we are shaped so much by where we grow up and who we surround ourselves with. And I've spoken to lots of people about this, BAME and non-BAME, and lots of older white men say that they've only been surrounded by just people like themselves. And if you're only surrounded by a certain type of person, you're only getting certain type of inputs. And maybe that is it's not that they are actually ignoring BAME people. It's not intentional. I think part of it is just I have come from such a diverse background that this is what I would like to surround myself with. And as just as you say, young people do expect it. When I walked into my company, I said to my boss, "Where is the diversity?" It was the only ethnic minority in my company, and I'm really pleased to say that this year we've made 5 hires from the ethnic minority community, which is fantastic. But because it's what we look for, it doesn't necessarily mean that older people are always surrounded by it. So I do think that there's a huge role for education over here. I think it's lots of it does come down to unconscious bias. We don't necessarily mean to exclude people intentionally, but sometimes it's just who we are surrounded by form our opinions. And it's just so important to be mindful of the fact that people I don't think people go out their way to actually be racist or exclude people intentionally. It's just who we surround ourselves with, and just be mindful of that, I think.
And I think when we were preparing for this panel, we reflected on the fact, and I certainly did, that unconscious bias is a far more mainstream term now than it was 5 years ago. People actually understand what it means. We've got one question, the lady there, and another one, the gentleman here and the lady there. So could we take those 3 questions? Did you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, I'm Pooja Agrawal, co-founder of Public Practice, and I also work in the GLA regeneration team, and a lot of my work there is about diversity in the sector. It's really, really great to hear from all of you the kind of different focuses of diversity, and this is something I struggle with quite a lot. Do you think you can make more of an impact by having a specific focus and advocating for a specific focus within diversity?
And can we take all three questions at once? I think you were next, and then lady there.
Thank you, Victoria. Samar Baghi in Kent School of Architecture and Planning. It's great, and I'm just going to use this opportunity to reflect on an event I was at yesterday, which is the Thames Estuary Growth Day. You know, great event, room full of people. There were more women on the panels during the day than there were in the room the whole day. You know, and I think there were some really great women. Lynn Carpenter, CEO at Thurrock, Jane Brigginshaw from Design England, Sadie Morgan from the Commission for the Thames Estuary. You know, some really fantastic speakers. So that's something to think about. The room, you could go on Flickr and look at the pictures. You know, it's full of those pale, male, pale and stale folk. But again, that's what that industry is. You know, there were some planners in the room, but mostly about construction and house building. So maybe there's something peculiar, if you like, to that industry. The other point is diversity. I live in Brighton, and again, it's one of those places which is celebrated. You know, diversity, pride is a big event. But actually, if you look at the council, if you look at those elected members, and these are people we interface with, I am sorry, there is no diversity. There's no BAME at all in a city which is celebrated for diversity within the UK. So I think that is something we also need to think about. You know, the people we interface with, the elected members. Actually, if we are diverse as a profession, if we interface with people who are not diverse at all and do not get it, then that's something we also need to chip at.
Okay, we'll just focus on those two first. So I think the first one was the conundrum. Should you sort of just focus on one particular aspect, or just try and do the whole lot as we've done tonight? Is let's just put it all together. And then the next, I think your question was really about the elected representation, and there's a complete sort of, I'm not sure if that's quite the right word to describe it, but it's a mismatch, if you like, to the community, to then those who are in power deciding the day-to-day decisions on the built environment. I'm inviting panellists to come back on either of those. Simon first.
I think I'd say that in terms of, I think it's really important that whenever you have having diversity of thought, because you're right. I mean, in any decision-making process, I actually had an interesting experience. One of the reasons why we set up the inspiration for setting up Planning Out was when I was invited to the Women in Planning parliamentary reception, and I went along, and I think it was the only man there actually, and I felt slightly uncomfortable actually, because it felt a bit strange being the only man, and that was actually a really useful experience, because I think for a lot of women, you'd perhaps walk into a room full of men, and you might feel uncomfortable, and it's something you just wouldn't necessarily think about. So it was a really sort of useful experience for me to kind of walk in and say, actually, it's sort of, because normally a man wouldn't necessarily have that feeling. I think the other point, though, is I'd like to just make about the male pale and stale thing is that I think it's important that, as I said, it's, we want to have diversity and we want to have a breadth of opinion, but also it's about changing people's hearts and minds as well, and not just sort of writing off white men as well, because it is important that we say, actually, we want to engage with our leadership, people in our leadership. Some of them will be men, so obviously a lot of them will be men, in those positions. But it's about saying, how can we influence, how can we change people's hearts and minds so that we represent the whole communities and that we live in a better society overall, and particularly from a planning perspective.
Yeah. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, I think.
Yeah.
What you say.
Yeah.
Perhaps, yes, Steve, you want to come?
A couple of things. I think that to answer the first question was about is it best to be focused. I've always been ambitious to be have a broad approach, and I think it's important that we try that. I also accept that we will make advances on certain areas faster than other areas, but I don't think that we should just focus on a particular area. And I know that from my own point of view, as mentioned earlier, if I look out on my planners in the civil service, my gender balance is fine. But that doesn't mean to say I think it's a job done. You need to think about the bigger agenda. But I do want to be challenging, and I want to be challenging because I think this is a challenging agenda, and I think that I don't necessarily find myself in agreement with the older generation accusation, which is, but I recognise it exists. But we've got to be careful that we don't equally find ourselves taking an approach to other people that we blame other people for taking to this agenda. So there's a lot of people out there who are my generation, who are white, who may be middle class, who actually do embrace this agenda. I've never had a regard where I've been racist or I've been prejudicial against people because of their sexual orientation. I've never done that. So it's not right to think that just because I may be the older person on the panel, that I'm the person that's the problem. Now, that's not to say that there aren't people of my generation out there who are, but we ourselves have got to be careful that we don't find ourselves as making assumptions about other people's attitudes, because that's exactly the sort of thing I'm trying to fight myself. To say that, and the unconscious bias thing is really interesting, because in the civil service now, it's a compulsory course. You have to do an unconscious bias course, which is in one of these online things. But everybody has to do it because it's embedded in the approach to say that everybody needs to be aware of these sorts of issues. And finally, on the elected members thing, I think it's interesting because that may be the case in Brighton, and you're right to raise it as an issue relating to representation and the community they represent. But there are authorities where that representation is more representative of the community. Lots of London boroughs are there, whether it be Tower Hamlets. I live in Waltham Forest. The Waltham Forest elected members are fairly diverse, and so again, we must be careful that we don't brand things in a way. We must keep an open mind.
But I think it's good to be challenging, and I think data is part of it, and we've been challenged as an institute to collect that data on elected member composition, and it's on the shopping list of things to do, actually, because I don't think anybody else does collect that data. And I think that's a fair point you raised, Steve, that there is a need to embrace everybody in the discussion, and dignity and respect apply across the piece, regardless of how old you are or what you look like. And I think that's a fair point. And I think that there would be too many people in the room that would disagree with that. So thank you for making that point. So
I think just to come into that as well, I think it's about creating a level playing field, and I think sort of looking at, is it a specific focus? I think, we're planners, we love a bit of evidence and data, don't we? So, let's apply that to this. And I think that's a really important point is, what does the data say? Does it say it needs a specific focus where you can get an action plan around it? Or is it sort of fit all? And I think the level playing field, but, I'm surprised positive discrimination hasn't come up sort of directly yet, but it sort of leaks into that point of view. But I think if you just say it's about level playing field, I think you sort of get yourself in the right position. And then I think also to answer the gentleman's question slightly, I think part of it is that you don't fall into planning, or you fall into planning. It's never sort of a career path, is it? It's normally because your neighbour's sort of a planner, or mine was, or your uncle, or someone who talks to you about it. You think, I'm going to do geography, and I don't really know what to do with it. So what about town planning? So I think the sort of almost the pool of the discussion around the built environment as a career gets very limited, and I think the more, and I know this is one of your passions, the more we can broaden that out, entry level, we can start really making some inroads in this debate as well.
And that's why for us apprenticeships are a really important part of this piece. Now, I know how important it is to continue this conversation over a more informal environment. I think I had, so I'm going to hand over to Mark in a moment to wrap up because we're 10 minutes over. I think we have one question there, did we? Or is that gone away? Liz? Yes. And unless there was another burning question, I'm not seeing anyone jumping up and down. I'm quite keen for this to be the closing question, so let's make it a good one.
No pleasure.
Okay, I'm Liz Lochran, and I run a small town planning consultancy in Farringdon, working on major projects for public sector and also for private developers. And I just want to point out that there is a huge distinction between the public and the private sector in terms of awareness. So as Steve is saying, there has been a huge amount of training in the public sector about diversity and actual training courses about unconscious bias and so forth. And unfortunately, I don't feel that very much of that is mirrored in the private sector. Except for some large law firms and maybe the large sort of top 50, 100 FTSE corporates. There is a long way to go in the private sector. As a woman working for principally male development teams, I have experienced what I would call discriminatory attitudes, which are quite hard to challenge because they're not verbalised, but they're coming in terms of behaviour. And actually, often the rescue route for us in that situation, I'm pleased to say, is that when we go into a pre-app situation with the public sector, often led by women, you know, women at Waltham Forest, for example, women at Camden Council, who are strong, you know, women at the GLA as well, who then correct misinterpretations of those male developers about how this application should be going, you know, essentially reinforcing the advice that I've already given. So there are all those kind of culture challenges that women need to address, the RTPI needs to address, you know. So when we're looking at these work streams, when Women in Planning is looking at these work streams, we need to look at them across lots of different bands, including being a woman entrepreneur who wants to carve out a career for herself as, you know, an independent like myself, or as women leading from the top in a larger corporate environment.
Would anyone like to sort of comment on that? Because I think that was an observation as opposed to a question. I mean, clearly we're in a sort of a best case example private sector environment today, and you've said, rightly so, the large organisations are really getting their houses in order. How do we tackle the smaller the smaller outfits? Is this just a... Not just smaller.
It's I have to say, it's a feeling. So even in larger organisations, it's particularly, I mean, this sounds very gender-based, but actually it's also BAME-based, very BAME-based. I think BAME have even a harder challenge facing them. Just a general discriminatory attitude, which is really unacceptable in the 21st century. How do we work out a system to bring up the built environment professions across the board? And that's a very collaborative type of effort.
Would anyone like to go back on that?
Yeah, I would. Just to comment on that, I mean, I totally agree with what you've just said. I mean, I'm sort of double whammy here. I'm a woman and I'm BAME, which makes it twice as hard. If I'm entirely honest, I was sitting around a boardroom table once where I was called an Indian princess by the client I was working with, which was, you know, I was really shocked, quite offended. Gave me the impression that my client wasn't taking me seriously, commented on two aspects of my identity. I'm not a princess, but focused on the fact that I'm a female, I'm Indian, which is my ethnicity. So that is really, really challenging. And I think, just to answer your question, how do you get more BAME people into this sector, which is the built environment? I think what I found, just through talking to other BAME people from sort of African backgrounds, Indian backgrounds, is that jobs in the property and planning sectors aren't just presented to them in the same way that law or medicine or accounting and finance are. Like, we are so influenced by our parents and what our parents want us to do, that if you don't target a child who is 11 or 12 and their parents, they're going to get to the age of 18 and their parents are going to have a substantial influence over what they should do at university. I know that my dad wanted me to be a pharmacist, and here I am sitting over here talking about planning and property and why diversity is important. And now my parents don't care; they're very happy, but they just didn't even know that all these different careers even existed for us. And so I was only presented with a very, very small pool. And in September, I went to a fair where I was, you know, talking to young Indian people and their parents, and I said, why is planning important? Have you ever thought about a career in planning? And all of them said no. Well, we've just been talking to the dentists and the doctors over there, and I said, well, actually, why don't you think about that planning application that's just been submitted to your local council down the road from you? I think that if you don't know about it, you can't even send that letter of support or objection to actually say, I don't like it. So I just think part of the reason is that BAME people just don't even know about the careers in our sector, and so I think part of it is like trying to sort of change the way that we approach recruitment, not just targeting people at graduate level, because by that point often it's too late. They've already decided, I'm going to go into law, finance, whatever. You've got to start actually speaking to young people, getting them to think about town planning and the built environment, and just understand that it's all around us, and that everything that we do in our lives comes back to planning and the built environment.
So there you go. To summarise that very powerful point, I think it's on all of us to go out and do our bit, whether that be an ambassador in a school, whether it be talking to people in our community, or whether it be something else. We should all be champions and ambassadors for the profession that we all care so passionately about. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Mark to wrap things up.
Thanks, Victoria. I hope, like I did, you all found that a fascinating discussion. I think, as Victoria said at the beginning, one of the most important things about these events is actually the networking afterwards, so we can talk to each other about what we just heard and what we just heard debated. So we'd be delighted if you would stay with us for a networking event. It's actually taking place in another building, not this building, so we've got a bit of a logistical challenge. So if I can encourage, when we finished in a moment and when we said thank you to the panel, we've got a number of people waiting outside to take us across to the building which is next door, up to the 14th floor in that building, for some drinks and some nibbles to allow us to network a bit further for another hour or so. So once we do that, if you can grab your stuff and perhaps leave as quickly as possible and follow the human chain across the road, so we don't lose anybody on the way. We're actually having some bridges built between our new building and this building. Unfortunately, they're not here for another 12 months because we haven't got planning permission. But I think before we do go, I'd just like to say thank you again for coming. We've been delighted to host this event. It's an important event. But thank you to Victoria for chairing, and thank you very much to our panellists tonight. And can we thank everybody in the traditional way?